At 45, I thought I'd seen enough life surprises to know when something was off, but nothing prepared me for the cascade of emotions that followed. Sarah, 42 and always so enigmatic, had never once hinted that she was discontent. Her cold indifference was a stark contrast to the intimacy we once shared. The message didn't come with explanations, apologies, or even a hint of regret. It was as if our years together had been nothing more than a temporary detour in her pursuit of something else, something buried in her past. That wasn't all. Almost immediately after Sarah's departure, my 20-year-old stepdaughter Emma began acting out in ways that stung like fresh wounds. Emma, who I'd once seen as a bright, albeit sometimes misunderstood, part of our family, now treated me with a venomous disregard. One afternoon, when I attempted to discuss our fractured reality, she snapped, "I don't owe you anything anymore," as if my presence was an obligation imposed upon her rather than a connection of care. Her words, cold and dismissive, cut deeper than any physical blow. I couldn't help but wonder, was her newfound defiance simply a reaction to the upheaval at home, or was it a reflection of the influence Sarah had always wielded over her? In the early hours after the revelation, as I roamed our empty halls and stared at photographs of what seemed like a happier past, I found myself questioning everything. I remembered the nights when Sarah's laughter filled the room, the plans we made for the future, and the silent promises we once believed in. Now, those memories felt like echoes from another life, one that had been systematically erased by indifference and betrayal. I tried calling Sarah, desperate for answers, but all I encountered was a cold voicemail and an automated message that confirmed nothing would change for the next 45 days. Each minute that ticked by without a word from her made the silence inside me grow louder. I was left alone with a maelstrom of emotions: hurt, anger, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a dismantling of the life I thought we had built together. The situation with Emma only deepened my despair. I remembered the way she used to look at me with gratitude, a silent acknowledgement that despite the unconventional start, I was her family. Now, her behavior felt like a direct mirror of Sarah's own betrayal. Was it possible that the seeds of resentment had been sown long ago, nurtured by whispered conversations and hidden truths? I couldn't shake the feeling that both Sarah and Emma were part of some larger plan I had never been privy to. That evening, as I sat alone in our once shared living room, the weight of my isolation became almost tangible. The muted glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains cast eerie shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to whisper of secrets and deceit. I began to wonder if Sarah's departure was merely the surface of a much deeper, more convoluted narrative. Had I missed the signs all along? Had her indifference been a carefully constructed facade? In the quiet moments before sleep could claim me, I jotted down my thoughts in a battered journal, a habit that had once brought me solace. I wrote about the betrayal, the silent accusations in Emma's tone, and the creeping suspicion that everything I knew about my family was built on unstable ground. The journal became my confidant, a silent witness to the unraveling of a life I once considered unshakable. As I stared at the blank page, I realized that the coming days would force me to confront not only the betrayal of those I trusted, but also the hidden corners of my own heart. I couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning, a prelude to a series of revelations that might turn my world upside down even further. The 45 days ahead loomed like a dark cloud, promising not just separation, but a journey into the heart of secrets, lies, and perhaps even redemption. Looking back now, I can't say for certain what was the catalyst for all this turmoil. Was it a moment of weakness on Sarah's part? Or had the foundation of our relationship been crumbling long before I ever noticed? The truth remained shrouded in mystery, a puzzle with pieces scattered across the fragments of our shared past. All I knew was that I was now on a collision course with a destiny I never chose, and with every unanswered question, the uncertainty grew more suffocating. In that moment of solitude, I made a silent promise to myself to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The road ahead was dark and fraught with peril, but I would not allow myself to be consumed by the betrayal that had so abruptly rewritten the rules of my life. With a heavy heart and a mind swirling with questions, I resolved to navigate the coming 45 days with a determination born of necessity. After all, sometimes the only way to find the light is to first walk through the darkness. I spent the next few days in a state of disbelief and simmering anger. Determined to get to the bottom of the betrayal, I began poring over every shred of evidence that might explain the sudden collapse of my life. It started with the bank statements. My hands trembled as I flipped through pages of transactions, and my heart sank when I discovered that over $85,000 had vanished from our joint account. Every withdrawal and transfer was a painful reminder that the person I trusted had been siphoning away our savings, piece by piece. I didn't stop there. I dug into the call logs on Sarah's phone, a task that felt like invading a forbidden realm. Hours later, after painstakingly analyzing hundreds of entries, one number stood out. A number that recurred with a frequency that sent chills down my spine. I counted hundreds of calls and messages exchanged with that same mysterious contact. The implications were clear. This wasn't the behavior of someone simply reconnecting with an ex. No, it pointed to something much deeper. Confronting the mounting evidence, I decided to trace that number. What I uncovered shocked me to my core. The frequent caller wasn't Sarah's ex-husband as she had claimed. It was her 35-year-old colleague. Couldn't believe it. The calculated way in which she had concealed her infidelity and the substantial financial embezzlement painted a picture of premeditated betrayal. It wasn't just a fleeting dalliance. It was a full-blown affair built on deception and financial manipulation. I sat back in my chair, the enormity of the betrayal pressing down on me. Every memory of shared moments with Sarah, every whispered promise, now felt like a lie. But amidst the sting of betrayal, a new resolve began to form. I wasn't going to be the victim in this twisted game. I decided to carefully collect all the evidence I could: bank records, call logs, text messages, and document every detail. I needed to build a case that would expose the truth and, in time, allow me to strike back. Over the next few days, I set up a secure folder on my computer, meticulously storing scanned copies of bank statements and digital backups of call logs. I even went as far as taking screenshots of text messages that hinted at secret meetings and coded language, evidence that pointed directly to Sarah's deliberate deception. Every file was a piece of the puzzle, and I was determined to put them together. I knew that I had to be cautious. The stakes were high, and one wrong move could allow Sarah or her colleague to cover their tracks or, worse, retaliate. I started researching legal options, talking to a discreet attorney who specialized in financial fraud and matrimonial disputes. I didn't reveal too much, just enough to get an idea of the legal battle that might be looming ahead. The attorney confirmed my worst fears. The more evidence I had, the more likely I was to hold them accountable, both legally and morally. But this wasn't just about reclaiming lost money or seeking justice through the courts. It was about reasserting control over my life. The betrayal had shattered my sense of security, but in its place, a burning desire for retribution was taking root. I began crafting a revenge plan, not in the spirit of vindictiveness alone, but as a means to ensure that I would never be so vulnerable again. It was time to turn the tables. I mapped out a strategy to expose the entire scheme. I intended to confront Sarah with the evidence, force her to acknowledge the truth, and then let the legal and social consequences unravel around her. I would not allow her or her colleague to erase my identity with their lies. The plan was simple in theory. Gather incontrovertible proof, present it to the right authorities, and, if necessary, make sure that every person who had been deceived, especially Emma, saw the truth for themselves. At night, as I sat in the dim light of my study, I found myself in a surreal mix of planning and reflection. Every click on my keyboard, every scan of a document, brought me closer to reclaiming what had been stolen. Not just the money, but my dignity and peace of mind. I had always prided myself on being methodical, and now every decision was calculated, every move precise. I wasn't going to let emotions cloud my judgment. This was a war of truth, and I was arming myself with undeniable evidence. I started a secure journal, noting down every discovery in detail. I wrote about the shock of the missing funds, the relentless string of phone calls, and the final, gut-wrenching realization that Sarah's betrayal was not just personal, but also deeply financial. I wrote in a style that felt raw and honest. A Reddit post in real time, laying out the story of my shattered life, one detail at a time. I even began considering posting parts of my journey anonymously online to warn others who might be ensnared in similar webs of deceit. With every passing day, my plan took on a life of its own. I wasn't just reacting to a betrayal anymore. I was orchestrating a meticulous counterattack. The evidence I was gathering was not just for a court of law, it was for my own liberation. I had been blindsided by the person I trusted most, but now, armed with the cold, hard facts, I was ready to expose the truth. The path ahead was treacherous, but I no longer felt like a victim. I was a man on a mission, determined, calculated, and, above all, unyielding in my quest for justice and retribution. As I closed my journal each night, I felt a strange sense of clarity amid the chaos. This betrayal, as devastating as it was, had given me a new focus. The coming days would test me in ways I had never imagined, but I was resolved to see it through. I was no longer just Richard, the betrayed husband. I was a man on a mission, ready to expose every lie, every hidden agenda, and reclaim every piece of what had been stolen from me. I knew I had to act quickly before the situation spiraled any further. With every piece of evidence I gathered, the betrayal felt more like a calculated attack rather than a momentary lapse. My first step was to secure my own financial future. I spent an entire morning in a haze of determination, logging into our joint accounts and methodically closing them down one by one. I transferred my share of the funds into a private account, an account only I had access to. That act, though small in the grand scheme of things, felt like reclaiming a part of my identity that had been stripped away. I wasn't content with just protecting my money. Sarah's misuse of our finances, especially her indulgent spending on beauty salons, extravagant travels, and endless shopping sprees, had fueled the betrayal. I took the bold step of blocking all the credit cards she frequently used. It was as if I was pulling the rug out from under her, forcing her to confront the reality of her choices without the easy escape of credit. Each click that confirmed a block sent a shiver down my spine, a mix of satisfaction and the bitter taste of retribution. But I wasn't done yet. I felt that the full weight of her actions needed to be felt not just in our personal finances, but in the professional realm as well. Sarah's employer was a prestigious real estate agency, a place where reputation was everything. I compiled a detailed dossier, outlining the questionable expenses and hotel reservations that painted a damning picture of her financial mismanagement. With a deep breath, I sent the dossier to the HR department and her supervisor, ensuring that every detail was laid out clearly and indisputably. It wasn't long before the repercussions began to manifest. Within days, I learned that Sarah had been temporarily suspended from work for violating the company's code of ethics. I watched from a distance as her once pristine professional image crumbled. The suspension wasn't just a setback for her career. It was a symbolic blow, a public acknowledgement of her betrayal and the consequences of her actions. I felt a pang of satisfaction, not out of cruelty, but from the realization that actions have consequences, and that no one is truly above accountability. Every move I made was deliberate and calculated. I knew the world of finance and corporate etiquette inside out, and I used that knowledge to tighten the noose around Sarah's reckless behavior. My plan wasn't just about damaging her reputation. It was about sending a clear message. Deceit, manipulation, and betrayal, no matter how subtle, would eventually catch up to those who practiced them. As I sat back in my study that evening, the glow of my computer screen illuminated a face set in grim determination. I wasn't doing this solely for myself. I was doing it for the integrity of everything that had been undermined by lies. In the solitude of my room, I reflected on the irony of it all. For years, Sarah had meticulously crafted an image of perfection, both at home and in her professional life. Now, one by one, I was dismantling that facade. The financial blow wasn't just a punitive measure. It was a reclaiming of the truth, a way to level the playing field after years of one-sided sacrifices and hidden manipulations. I continued to document every step of the process in my secure journal. The entries were raw and unfiltered, an ongoing narrative of the downfall of what I once believed was a solid foundation of trust and mutual respect. I knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, both legal and personal. But in that moment, I allowed myself to feel a glimmer of hope. With each account closed and each credit card blocked, I was regaining control piece by piece. The ripple effect of these actions began to extend beyond the immediate financial realm. Friends and colleagues, who had once been oblivious to the undercurrents in our relationship, started to whisper about the sudden suspension at Sarah's work. The professional community was abuzz with speculation, and it wasn't long before the story became public fodder. A cautionary tale of misplaced trust and the dire consequences of personal betrayal seeping into the corporate world. Even Emma, my stepdaughter, seemed to notice the shift. Though her earlier defiance had cut deep, there was now a palpable tension in the air, an awareness that the dynamics at home were shifting in ways that none of us could have predicted. The boundaries were being redrawn, and while I still hoped for a semblance of reconciliation, I knew that the truth could no longer be buried under layers of lies. As I lay in bed that night, the adrenaline of the day slowly fading into a somber calm, I realized that I was no longer the passive bystander in my own life. Every measure I took was a reclaiming of power, a statement that I would not be defined by betrayal. The steps I'd taken might have felt drastic, perhaps even ruthless to some, but they were the necessary moves in a high-stakes game where the only rule was truth. In the quiet darkness, with the hum of the city outside and the soft glow of the moon casting shadows through my window, I allowed myself a moment of introspection. I wasn't entirely unscathed by the ordeal, nor did I expect immediate justice or satisfaction. But in that moment, I recognized that I was actively shaping the narrative of my life, one where betrayal did not equal defeat, but rather became the catalyst for transformation. Every keystroke, every document filed, was a step toward a future where deception was met with unwavering resolve. The financial blow I had dealt to Sarah was more than a retaliatory act. It was a reclaiming of my life's narrative. And as I drifted off to sleep, the image of those blocked transactions and closed accounts loomed large, a silent testament to a turning tide, a harbinger of the challenges yet to come, and a promise that truth, no matter how buried, would eventually rise to the surface. Things took a darker, more personal turn when Emma's behavior escalated. It wasn't just the cold betrayal from Sarah that cut deep anymore. It was also the aggressive defiance coming from someone I'd once considered a daughter. I remember the exact moment. After one of those bitter confrontations, Sarah had told her with a callous edge, "You don't owe him anything." Those words were like a spark, igniting something in Emma that turned her behavior from sullen silence into open hostility. I watched as the person I cared for started to echo her mother's manipulative tone, her eyes hardening with a mix of anger and confusion. It was painful to see that she was being swayed by the toxic narrative Sarah had long imposed on her. I knew I had to act, not just to protect my own sanity, but to help Emma see beyond the poisonous words that had been fed to her for so long. After some agonizing contemplation, I reached out to Michael, Emma's biological father. Michael, at 48, had been kept at arm's length by Sarah for years, his presence reduced to distant memories and sporadic contact. But I knew he was someone Emma could trust, a man who cared about her enough to put aside past grievances. I contacted him discreetly, explaining the full extent of the situation. The betrayal, the financial chaos, and now, the emotional manipulation that was hurting Emma. Michael was as shocked as I was, but more importantly, he was willing to help. Together, we embarked on a delicate mission to regain custody, or at least to give Emma a choice about where she truly belonged. Michael's re-entry into her life wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a chance for Emma to see another side of family, one that wasn't clouded by deception and self-interest. We worked through the legal channels, gathering evidence and testimonials that painted a picture of a household manipulated by Sarah's bitter directives. It wasn't an easy process. Every step was fraught with emotional turmoil and the risk of further fracturing the fragile bond with Emma. I'll never forget the day Michael finally sat down with Emma. It was in a quiet, sunlit park, a setting far removed from the tension of our home. Michael spoke with gentle firmness, reminding her of the love and security she deserved. Slowly, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes as she began to question the narrative she'd been told so many times. The idea that she could choose her own path, that she wasn't bound by Sarah's manipulations, was a revelation for her. As days turned into weeks, Emma started to pull away from her mother's harsh words. There were moments of silence, followed by long, introspective looks that spoke volumes. She began to ask questions about her past, about Michael, and about the promises of a different kind of future. I wasn't sure how to feel at first. Part of me was relieved to see her waking up from the haze of deceit, but another part mourned the loss of the bright, trusting girl I once knew. In my late-night journal entries, I wrote about the bittersweet nature of these changes. Emma's eyes held a newfound clarity today. I noted one evening, as if for the first time she was seeing the world, and her mother's words, for what they really were. I watched from a distance as the dynamic slowly shifted, each conversation with Michael chipping away at the walls Sarah had built around her. There was a moment of raw vulnerability when Emma, seemingly caught between two worlds, confided in me. "I'm confused," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always thought I owed you something because you were here, but now, I'm not sure what to believe." It was then I realized that what we were doing wasn't about winning a custody battle or righting old wrongs. It was about giving Emma the freedom to choose her own family, her own path. This was a turning point. With Michael steadily re-establishing his presence in her life, Emma began to doubt the absolute truth of her mother's assertions. Every new conversation with Michael, every tender moment of genuine care, was a counterbalance to the toxic narrative that had long dominated her life. I could sense the internal battle raging within her, a struggle between the familiar lies of Sarah and the stark, honest love that Michael and I were trying to offer. In those moments, I also confronted the irony of my own situation. Here I was, seeking retribution against Sarah for her betrayal, while also fighting to rescue a young soul from the clutches of manipulation. The personal and the political, the revenge and the redemption, all intertwined in a way that made every decision feel like a double-edged sword. But I knew one thing for certain. Emma deserved the chance to decide for herself who she could trust, and I wasn't going to let her be a casualty in the aftermath of Sarah's selfish games. As I continued documenting every twist and turn in my secure journal, I kept reminding myself that the ultimate goal was not just retribution. It was to restore a sense of justice and authenticity to our lives. The battle for control over Emma was only one front in a larger war, but it was perhaps the most personal and profound. In the end, the real victory would be if she could break free from the chains of deceit and choose a future built on genuine care and truth. It started with a call I never wanted to answer, a call from her ex-husband. I remember the exact moment I heard his voice, strained and bitter, as he told Sarah that he was done playing the role of a backup. He'd finally realized that he wasn't the man she truly wanted, just a safety net for her whims. It was as if the final domino had fallen, marking the beginning of her unraveling. I watched, a silent witness to the collapse of a person who once commanded her own narrative, as she was unceremoniously kicked out of what she thought was a relationship, a facade that had allowed her to maintain control over her world. Her world was built on layers of deceit, and now, one by one, those layers were crumbling. Sarah, always so confident and imperious, soon found herself bereft of any shelter. In a desperate bid to salvage what she could, she reached out to me, seeking reconciliation, pleading for a second chance. But as I stared at the message on my phone, a hesitant, almost remorseful plea, I knew I couldn't allow her to waltz back into my life without facing the consequences of her actions. With the same cold finality I'd embraced in my actions, I changed the locks on the house. Every time I turned that key in the lock, it felt like a symbolic act of reclaiming my space, a final farewell to the life that had been tainted by betrayal. When Sarah finally mustered the courage to come by, her eyes were filled with a desperation I hadn't seen before. She stood on the doorstep, a shadow of the once commanding woman I knew, and asked if she could retrieve a few of her things. I hesitated, torn between a lingering remnant of what we once shared and the need to protect what little stability I had left. But in the end, I did what I thought was right. I had arranged for her possessions to be collected, a decision that now seemed as inevitable as the collapse of the empire she'd built on lies. I watched from a distance as her belongings, each item a relic of a life that was now past, were loaded into a truck. The realization that hit me wasn't one of triumph, but rather a heavy sadness for a person who had once been so full of promise. Later, I learned that her things had already been taken to the dump, a final, irrevocable act that sealed her fate. In that moment, Sarah lost everything. Her home, the sanctuary she'd so carefully curated, was gone. Her financial safety net, already frayed by her imprudent decisions and reckless spending, was obliterated. And more painfully, she had lost her family, the fragile bonds that had once tethered her to a semblance of stability. I sat in the silence of my study, the echo of the closing door still ringing in my ears, and wondered if I'd done too much. Not because I regretted reclaiming my life, but because I couldn't help but mourn the total annihilation of a person I once knew. Sarah's complete collapse wasn't just a victory for me. It was the collapse of a carefully constructed persona that had thrived on manipulation and control. Now, stripped of all her material security and social pretenses, she was forced to face a raw, unvarnished truth. Every lie, every calculated move, had led her to this moment of utter devastation. In the days that followed, I saw the fallout ripple through her once perfect world. Former colleagues distanced themselves, whispers of scandal filled the air, and the glamorous life she'd led dissolved into a cautionary tale. The prestigious real estate agency where she had once commanded respect began to distance itself, the ethical breaches now too glaring to ignore. Friends and acquaintances who had admired her polished exterior now saw a woman undone by her own actions. And even Emma, caught in the crossfire of her mother's manipulation, began to see the stark difference between genuine care and the hollow promises of a shattered dream. I documented everything meticulously in my journal, a habit that had become a lifeline amidst the chaos. I wrote about the irony of her pleading for forgiveness when she had been the architect of her own ruin. I recorded every moment of her disintegration, every whispered rumor of her downfall, as if the very act of writing could somehow restore order to the chaos. Yet, in those entries, I also found a measure of solace. The collapse of Sarah's world, though painful to witness, had restored a sense of balance. It was a reminder that every action has its consequence, that deceit carries a price too steep to bear. As I reflect on that tumultuous period, I can't help but feel a complex mix of emotions. Part of me feels vindicated, a vindication born not out of cruelty, but out of a deep-seated need for justice. Yet, there is also a lingering sorrow for the irreparable loss of a person who, beneath the layers of lies and manipulation, was once capable of something real. Sarah's complete collapse was not just the end of her carefully curated life. It was the painful unmasking of the truth we all so desperately try to hide. And as the dust settles on the ruins of her former life, I am left to wonder, can there ever be redemption after betrayal? Or is the price of deceit too steep to ever reclaim what once was? I thought the worst was behind me when I started rebuilding my life after Sarah's complete collapse. But as if the fates weren't done testing me yet, I soon discovered another twist in her desperate campaign of revenge. Out of the blue, I received an anonymous email from HR at my company, a message that would have sent chills down my spine if I hadn't been so determined to stand my ground. The email was a formal complaint lodged against me, filled with accusations designed to tarnish my hard-earned reputation. And though the sender's identity was hidden behind layers of anonymity, the style and details of the complaint were unmistakably reminiscent of Sarah's manipulative tactics. I learned about the complaint through an unexpected source, a confident colleague who'd been following my case closely ever since the upheaval began. He whispered that he'd heard rumors that Sarah had pulled the same dirty trick on her ex-husband years ago, using false allegations to try to ruin his credibility. My heart pounded as I realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of behavior, a calculated plan to dismantle the lives of those who dared to cross her. Determined not to be caught off guard again, I began a careful investigation of my own. I delved into my company's records, scouring email trails and memos, looking for any sign that might point to the complaint's origins. I reached out to contacts, piecing together information that painted a consistent picture. A woman who had used her cunning to sabotage the careers of those who had dared to defy her, not just once, but repeatedly. Every shred of evidence I uncovered tightened the noose around her carefully constructed narrative. I soon realized I wasn't alone in this fight. Her ex-husband, the same man who'd once been cast aside as a backup, was now reaching out to me. He had heard of the complaint too, and his voice was laced with bitter irony. He'd been on the receiving end of a similar, insidious tactic, engineered by Sarah in an attempt to blackmail him into submission. Although our past was far from amicable, it was clear that Sarah's web of deceit had ensnared us both, and we would have to work together to untangle it. Setting aside our differences, we formed an uneasy alliance. Our combined evidence, gathered from multiple sources and timelines, began to reveal an undeniable pattern. Sarah had orchestrated false complaints before, knowing full well the damage such actions could inflict. With every piece of corroborative evidence I uncovered, my resolve grew stronger. I documented every conversation, every email, and every shady transaction in a secure journal, my personal archive of her misdeeds. The turning point came when we managed to secure a critical piece of evidence, a recorded conversation where Sarah, speaking carelessly on a phone call, bragged about her ability to manipulate people and institutions. In that moment of hubris, she let slip details about her strategy. The false complaint against me was merely the latest in a series of premeditated attacks. With this bombshell of evidence in hand, we approached the HR department together, our footsteps echoing with a shared determination for justice. The meeting with HR was a tense affair. I could see the wheels turning in the minds of the decision-makers as we laid out our evidence, piece by damning piece. The credibility of the anonymous complaint crumbled in the face of the irrefutable facts we presented. It became clear that Sarah's machinations had crossed a line. She had not only attempted to ruin my career, but had also violated legal and ethical boundaries in the process. Faced with the overwhelming proof of her duplicity, the HR department had no choice but to take decisive action. Sarah was forced to withdraw the complaint immediately, as failure to do so would have meant criminal prosecution for fraud and defamation. The very institution she had hoped to manipulate now stood as a bulwark against her toxic influence. In that moment, as the weight of Sarah's latest failed revenge sank in, I experienced a bittersweet victory. The setback was not just a personal triumph. It was a resounding statement that deception and malice would not prevail. Though Sarah's attempts to destroy me had been thwarted, I couldn't help but reflect on the deeper wounds this entire ordeal had inflicted on all of us. Her calculated moves had not only endangered my professional life, but had also threatened to drag down others who had already suffered from her relentless ambition. Looking back now, I realized that every twist in this saga was a harsh lesson in trust, resilience, and the cost of betrayal. Working alongside her ex-husband, who once played a supporting role in her twisted narrative, I found a kind of redemption in proving that truth could withstand even the most sinister plots. The scars of these events would remain with me for a long time, a constant reminder of how quickly life can unravel when manipulated by a master of deceit. Yet, as I pen down these thoughts in my secure journal, a digital testament to my journey, I feel a sense of cautious hope. I've learned that while revenge can sometimes be a catalyst for reclaiming one's dignity, true healing comes only when the cycle of betrayal is broken. For now, the immediate threat has been neutralized, and the falsehoods that Sarah tried so desperately to spread have been laid bare for all to see. And even as I brace myself for the uncertain days ahead, I carry with me the knowledge that no matter how far someone might go to undermine your life, standing up for the truth remains the most powerful form of retribution. 6 months have passed since the whirlwind of betrayal, revenge, and shattered lives. I almost don't remember the face of the woman who once tore our lives apart. It's strange, time has a way of dulling even the sharpest wounds. I've slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, one where my days are no longer shadowed by constant vigilance and simmering anger. Life, in its relentless pace, has a way of forcing you to move on, even if it means forgetting the past entirely. I wake up on a crisp autumn morning, the golden hues of dawn gently pulling me back to reality. I sip my coffee, reading the headlines, laughing at an old joke on a social media feed. It's as if the tumult of the last year was a distant memory, replaced by a comforting routine. I often wonder if Sarah even exists in my world anymore. In many ways, my deliberate choice to let go has been my most profound act of revenge. True retribution, I've come to understand, isn't about wrecking someone else's life. It's about reclaiming your own. Meanwhile, Sarah's world has crumbled into a chaotic mess of instability and despair. The woman who once seemed invincible now finds herself teetering on the edge of poverty. I've heard whispers that she's been forced to rely on the kindness of friends and acquaintances, drifting from one temporary shelter to another. The glamorous lifestyle, the carefully constructed facade, all lie in ruins. Her name, once synonymous with success and control, is now barely uttered in polite conversation. And in this fall from grace, there's an undeniable irony. The person who so meticulously engineered the downfall of others has become a cautionary tale in her own right. I was caught completely off guard on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon when Emma, now emerging from the haze of her mother's influence, approached me with a look that mixed resolve and resignation. Standing in the doorway of my modest, carefully rebuilt sanctuary, she said quietly, almost as if it were a confession, "I have nothing more to expect from her." Those words struck me like a final exclamation mark to a turbulent chapter of our lives. In that moment, I recognized the bittersweet liberation that comes with truly letting go. Emma's transformation has been the one beacon of hope amid the storm of betrayal. For years, she'd been a silent casualty of her mother's manipulations, torn between the remnants of loyalty and the harsh reality of betrayal. And now, in declaring that she expects nothing more from Sarah, Emma was choosing her own future over a legacy of pain. It was a declaration of independence, a subtle yet profound final blow to a woman who had long lost any claim to being part of our lives. I handed Emma a folded piece of paper with the address of the rehabilitation center where, I was told, Sarah had been admitted for intensive treatment. It was the only tangible reminder of her, a symbol that the road to recovery, if such a thing were even possible for someone like her, had to start somewhere. But as I watched Emma tuck the paper into her bag, I realized that I would not be looking back. This chapter was closed forever. As the seasons changed and the world moved on, I found myself fully immersed in the life I'd reclaimed. Work, friendships, new hobbies, all came to fill the void left by the absence of a toxic presence. I learned that true revenge isn't found in the destruction of the enemy. It's found in the simple, liberating act of forgetting. To let go is to choose peace over perpetual conflict, to prioritize one's own well-being above the need for retribution. Looking back now, I see that the real victory wasn't in the elaborate schemes or the calculated maneuvers. It was in the quiet moments of self-acceptance and renewal. I no longer dwell on Sarah's misdeeds, nor do I let the past define my present. I have moved on, not because I forgot what happened, but because I refuse to let it continue to dictate the course of my life. In a world where vengeance is often celebrated, I've learned that the most potent form of revenge is simply living well. I've turned my back on the bitterness of yesteryears and embraced a future built on resilience and genuine connection. The final blow came not with an explosion of fury, but with a gentle, liberating act, the act of forgetting. And in that act, I found my true freedom, a new beginning forged from the ashes of a lost, painful past.